Hello, Lumen employees / Mudbeards, and today we're gonna... One second. Today, we're going to be going into what exactly was going on with the new episode of Severance, Sweet Vitriol. And if there's one piece of advice Miss Casey would have for your innie this week, it's that your Audi is patient. See, this episode is only 30 minutes long, and while there were a lot of pros that could come with that, there are also a lot of cons. I'll get into that towards the end of the episode. But essentially, this episode is what we call a practice in world building. See, a lot of shows, to establish the world or the environment the characters are placed in, you need to have an episode or a series of episodes that really hammer down the type of world or environment people are in. And so far throughout the show, we've seen every bit of the outside world we see has been pretty weird or quirky in some way. A lot of it even coming down to the point where the timelines just don't add up, a lot of 90s cars and seemingly modern eras. This is the first episode where we get to see a relatively normal town. And while the events that transpired in this episode, it could be summed up to a relatively short sentence, we did get a lot of reveals and things established. This episode opens up with Miss Cobel brushing her teeth, which could be nothing. She's been traveling a while, she's probably been driving for like 35 days straight, so makes sense that she'd want to brush her teeth after a while, but we do know that Lumen has something heavily incorporated with teeth and dental work altogether, as we see with the smiling wall. But another thing I noticed is that Lumen is supposed to recycle, and Miss Cobel definitely did not. Shame. See, Cobel is back seemingly visiting her hometown. This hometown was one of the first towns Lumen had been across when they were establishing their great little industry that they have going. And what images of this town show us is how Lumen established themselves within the town and what the town turns into once Lumen eventually departs. We can see that when Lumen had first established themselves there may have not been much of the town going on in the first place.
There was no town before the factory.
See, according to Sissy, apparently when Lumen had first arrived, there may have not been too much going on in the town in the first place. Eventually, they did establish an ether factory, and a lot of the kids were seemingly forced into labor there. Which, ironically enough, said ether is the only remnants left of Lumen's involvement with said town. But that's besides the point. See, while these kids were work there, they would actually partake in consuming some of this ether, turning a lot of them into drug addicts, some of which we probably saw wandering around the town at the beginning of the episode. However, we also know that this Egan's ether is actually pretty cherished by Lumen and its employees, Cobel even finding it offensive that nowadays her old flame is actually using it to sell.
It's shameful that you sell it.
Which could be another method in how this ether is spread around the town and developing such drug addicts. But we see that Sissy wants no part of it, staying away from the town in a house up by herself. Seemingly the house that Cobel had grown up in. It's revealed to us that at some point when the Egans were involved with the town, they held a sort of winter tide, which I believe was how they were able to find people who had Kier living within them, hence Harmony Cobel, and they probably took these people and sent them to get re-educated, hence Cobel being sent to the Myrtle Egan School for Girls. It obviously was not voluntary, since when she was sent, her mom was sick and she didn't even get to say goodbye. See, if the development of ether is how Egan had established themselves in so many places and gotten to the prominence that they had, then it makes you wonder what eventually skyrocketed their industry to where it is today. Well, that was revealed this episode as well. See, the reason Miss Cobel was probably sent to the Myrtle Egan School for Girls was because Jamie seeing Kier within her was actually him seeing how much of a genius she actually was. Here's my theory. I think when the Egans were establishing their town, they probably continued to vocalize their worship of Kier and who Kier was as a person, and hearing the story of Kier and his severing of himself as Dieter in the 4th appendix probably inspired Cobel to want to invent a new form of severance. Now, keep in mind, the advancements in medical technology in the last 25 years has been insane. And the fact that Cobel, at only 8 years old or younger, was establishing a notebook with full-on reintegration technology and severing technology, something that doesn't even exist in our world, is insane if you think about the time period she wrote it in. Even Sissy was surprised by the amount of effort and knowledge that Cobel had put into that notebook. Which makes me believe that the reason they had sent her off to the Myrtle's Egan School for Girls so quickly was because they quickly wanted to put what she had wrote down into practice, and while she would be distracted getting re-educated or learning more about Kier involuntarily, they would be able to incorporate all of these things and actually put it into work with their resources that they have. So essentially a lot of Lumen we see today probably is the way it is because of Cobel. It's already been confirmed that severing didn't really exist till James Egan invented it. Now we know that he didn't, and he just took Cobel's work. And we already know Lumen has a history of taking really talented workers, using them all up and squeezing them out for all of their talent juice, and essentially just leaving them be. They don't really have any care for their workers post what they can provide for them. This plays into a theory I touched on in another one of my videos, which essentially boils down to eventually Lumen is going to reach a divide, and that will be between the Egans running Lumen and the administrative side. But now that Cobel has access to this notebook, it means that she potentially could utilize this to take some more control back from Lumen in some way, or maybe even continue work on the severing process or technology as a whole. But I have seen some people online that think that essentially with Mark and Gemma reaching out to her by the end of the episode, this means that Cobel will officially be Team Rebel against all of the people in Lumen. And I don't necessarily think that is the case. I do think that if they play around with the narrative that Cobel and Mark are going to team up and be buddy-buddy, you can only expect bad things to happen with Mark. See, what I'm thinking is that Cobel will use Mark to get what she wants, and what she wants is to run Lumen herself. I think while the Egans are dedicated to wealth, power, getting themselves established in their name, Cobel is genuinely devoted to Kier. We know that for a fact. So, if the whole plan is to bring Kier back and make everybody Kier's children, and the Egans are slowing down that process, chasing other avenues, then it would make sense why Cobel is finally taking the fight to them. However, that does not mean that she's on Mark's side. See, if her goal is to bring Kier back, then, like I referenced in some of my other videos, she could be utilizing Mark or Gemma's body to do just that. So while we might be relieved that Devin is reaching out to the very person who invented Severance rather than Ragabi, there could be a reason to believe that Ragabi is the right choice, despite the fact that she left last week, which this episode could explain why Ragabi left last week in the first place. See, when Ragabi left, she left specifically because Devin was about to call Cobel. I personally thought this was a crazy idea, but I didn't think Devin would actually pull through with it. However, the threat was obviously enough by itself to send Ragabi out of there. Sure, Ragabi could have just been worried because Cobel is high up in Lumen and potentially could get a lot of things down, maybe even get her killed. But what I think is that Ragabi knows Cobel is the actual inventor of the severing process altogether, and Ragabi maybe is fine-tuning the reintegration process. And the reason she had left so quickly was because she didn't want Cobel to get her hands on the reintegration process. Why could that be, you may ask? In my opinion, it's because reintegration is the final key in what could be resurrecting Kier in some way. See, in my last video, we already touched on the fact that on the surface, Lumen is seemingly using the chip to test the capabilities and putting it on a mass production scale. However, there is an argument to be made that they could potentially instead be utilizing an innie or a outie subconscious or some combination of multiple to resurrect Kier. That or create the perfect severance, which in other words would mean perfectly being able to control all of your emotions. Hence why severing was invented in the first place. Kier and Dieter was an allegory for someone controlling their darker emotions. We know that most people that fall in line with Lumen fully believe in taming your tempers. Throughout this episode, we get several nods to someone bringing woe to their life, someone being filled with malice. Even at the end, when Cobel's old flame is taking a stand, she makes a threat to whoever's approaching, seemingly Mr. Drummond.
Come tame these tempers of assholes.
See, that was a pretty cool scene, but either way, all in all, that was my theory for where I think the story could be going, but I do want to touch on my personal thoughts on this episode. While I thought this episode wasn't necessarily a filler or a waste because it did have a lot of things integral from Cobel's character development potentially to her actual backstory, as well as showing us Lumen's effects on the outside world as a whole. It's good to actually see rather than just get some glimpses. It also shows us that some of the quirky weirdness we see throughout the show really hones in on the center of Lumen's base of operations and becomes more and more normal the far and farther out you go. However, my only problem was this episode was only 30 minutes. I think a lot of people can agree. Sure, you can see this episode as an episode fully dedicated to Cobel and giving the actor a chance to fully display their range of talents, but I do think if you were going to do that, you should utilize an entire hour's worth of an episode like everything else. See, this 30-minute segment seems like it could have been a C-plot storyline that took place alongside other episodes, specifically episode 5 and episode 6. If you had some of these segments taking place throughout those episodes, we'd probably still reach the same point. We might be an episode lower in the season, but if you look at the structure of the season as a whole, we've now had 2 bottle episodes of character development. And while last week's episode was amazing, this week's episode was much shorter and felt less intentional to display some of the talents of either the directors or writers or whatever, and it was more to keep the narrative going at a certain pace. But in my opinion, this episode kind of broke the pacing. Again, by itself, it's a great episode of television, better than most episodes of television out there. However, just structurally speaking, it messed up the narrative just a tiny bit for me. Point is, everything we got within the episode narratively was super awesome. I'm happy to see where the story's gonna go. I feel like this episode did give a lot of us theorists and analytical types to work with. But otherwise, yeah, that was Egan's Ether and how the Lumen Corporation had single-handedly proven that they will screw over anyone it takes to get what they want, and how soon that's gonna come and bite them all in the ass. Again, I think Cobel's gonna come back, she's gonna take out the Egans, she's gonna run Lumen herself, and she's gonna be the final threat that all of our characters are gonna have to take down. But let me know what you guys think. I'm genuinely curious. Again, I'll be watching the next episode live when it comes out next week. Thank you all for watching and your support. I'm always open to suggestions for what you want to see on the channel. But otherwise, have a good rest of your day. Don't do too much ether out there. And remember, taming tempers is something only assholes do. Have a good one, y'all.